Hello, everyone. My name is Jeremy Andrick, Program Manager on the HILL Project, and I'm here today to talk about using school renewal rounds, which is the HILL Project's adaptation of the Harvard model of instructional rounds, to systemically drive school renewal. And the key guiding assumption is that when school teams purposefully observe and reflect on their classroom practices using objective data, they're better able to sustain motivation, focus, and positive growth. The objectives for today are to check and grow understanding of how school renewal rounds can develop, refine, and monitor instructional leadership practices, and also just to get you thinking about assessing the readiness to internally sustain the school renewal rounds process. And so this just gets us thinking about, okay, why school renewal rounds? Why this process? And so I want you to just talk for a minute about how have you developed and observed practices that you have established as goals for your school up to this day? Have you used walkthroughs? Have you used learning walks? What does that look like at your school? And how have you aligned professional development opportunities to your priority instructional growth targets, which you determined from those walkthroughs, learning walks, maybe the teacher evaluation process? So just take a couple minutes and think about how have you truly understood the current state of your classroom practice and thought about next steps in alignment with the current state of those classroom practices. So go ahead and stop the video right here, talk for a couple minutes, and come back when you're ready. Welcome back. And so hopefully you had a fruitful discussion. So a key research supported idea that really drove our work with adapting the Harvard model was our core belief that collaborative observation methods like school renewal rounds, rooted in Harvard model, increase collaboration, reduce barriers, and increase social trust. And we know these are all important pieces if we are really trying to create a cohesive, coherent learning environment for our teachers and for our students. We know that teaching can be a very isolating profession. And one of our assumptions is that when you conduct a process like school renewal rounds, which includes more teachers as time goes on, that you can reduce those barriers, that you can get support teachers with moving out of what can be a very isolating profession where it's classroom by classroom. How do we blur those lines to where everyone has a shared idea and common understanding of the current state of classroom practice and what are the next best steps? And so before implementing school renewal rounds, there are things to consider for your own implementation. I did include this slide. These are the core leadership principles, the HILL leadership principles for the HILL project. And on the left, you'll see positive core and collective ownership. So that's like building the motivation for the work. How do we use a strengths-based growth mindset and looking at things through an opportunity lens and saying, okay, this is what we're good at. How do we build upon that? And then you have the collective ownership. How can we distribute leadership amongst the staff? How do we share responsibility? How do we develop trust within each other? And how do we become interdependent to where we know each other's role and we know who to access and when? So you look on the right-hand side, so you have the positive core in place, you have the collective ownership, and those, again, don't ever go away, and they continue to weave themselves throughout. But as you shift and as you get that in place, thinking about evidence-based decisions and organizational learning. And so a key piece for rounds is the whole collaborative inquiry. So where you have walkthroughs, you have maybe a principal, maybe a couple of teachers walking through, having a brief discussion around what they saw and maybe providing, glows and grows. I'm thinking about that, but is it truly collaborative in nature? You have learning walks, which can be truly collaborative in nature. So what makes rounds different? In our view, what makes rounds different is its systemic approach and its increasing inclusion of teachers to drive that process through that ongoing collaboration. And so, once you get that in place, then the organization begins to learn and you start to reflect upon practice. You start to ask yourself, okay, this is what is, but does it have to be that way? How can we think differently about our current state of classroom practice and the learning that coincides with our understanding of the current state of classroom practice? And so again, I just wanted to briefly touch on these 4 leadership principles just to provide context for our adaptation. So hopefully that makes sense. But prior to implementing school renewal rounds, you will always want to consider the relation of school renewal rounds to other processes in terms of the district or the school. And so we all know teacher evaluation is a big deal, right? And so teacher evaluation is one thing. School renewal rounds can support collective growth in instructional practices to support teacher evaluation. But again, there are two distinct systems. And when you're considering implementing school renewal rounds, you want to think of keeping it objective and away from evaluation as much as possible. And hopefully keeping it completely in two silos. But you do need to consider, if we're implementing school renewal rounds, how does that support district processes? And how maybe does it stray from district processes? And how can you bring that alignment back into focus in terms of, okay, so we're doing this, district's doing this, how do we make sure that we're staying in alignment? So again, that's just a consideration as you decide whether you want to pursue school renewal rounds as a process that will drive your work on school change. And so just to get to the core of it, why is it even important to monitor your current state of instruction? It's essential that we have, as a principal, it's essential to have a very clear picture of what your teachers are doing in the classroom, where their strengths are, where their opportunities for growth are. But the power of rounds is, how do we turn that into a collective endeavor? How do we encourage teachers to have that same understanding as, say, the principal does? And how do we share those perspectives to the point where the principal is part of the team, and then you have other individuals that are part of the team where everyone's learning from each other and everybody has a voice? And how do we encourage those voices to support our alignment? So if we say we're focusing on small groups, how do we encourage leadership to support that small group work? What school conditions do we need to focus on? Just so that we have clarity on what our next steps should be. And so here you see the phases. And the reason why I share this is it's very vital and important, because if you think about it, there are phases to school renewal, and what many will call school improvement. And the way that we view it within the Hill Project is, phase one is just getting that true understanding, working on that positive core, starting to develop that collective ownership, and looking at things through a strengths-based mindset. So that's phase one, and merging into phase two. Phase two, we develop a performance profile. So that would be all your data sets that you include in your school improvement plans. Everything that just presents that clear picture of, this is our current state in all aspects. Phase three, we align our growth targets. So where are students showing strengths, and where are they showing opportunities for growth, and using that real-time data to determine those. And so where school renewal rounds comes in is that thinking about what classroom practices support those growth targets. And then you think of that another level, and you think of, how does the principal support all of this? How does the principal support the conditions or facilitate the conditions for this collaborative endeavor to take place? Okay, so that's phase three. So then phase four, once we have those growth targets in place, once we know what our focus is for classroom instruction, whether it's small groups, interactive read alouds, so that focus is now clear. And the alignment with how to support student priority growth targets is clear. Now you've moved it to monitoring. How do we monitor that those teacher behaviors are in place and embedded within each classroom, so that there aren't pockets of excellence, but that the whole school, every classroom is demonstrating evidence-based classroom practice behaviors in each classroom. And then phase five, reflecting and renewing. So basically, are we doing what we said we would do? Are we seeing the behaviors that we want to see? Are we seeing student growth? And if we are, then you consider focusing on the next best step. So for this session, now let's get into the work. In phases 1 through 4, school renewal rounds are utilized to identify strengths and growth edges, as I've discussed, identify strength in instructional practice, identify strengths and growth edges in principal and other support behaviors and school conditions, develop, refine, and assess gold standard behaviors for teachers, principals, and others who share responsibility for implementing and supporting those research-based practices, and then finally to monitor the systemic and systematic implementation of those behaviors in all classrooms. That's what we want to see, so that every child benefits from effective instruction. So here you see the phases. And this is the Hill Project phases. And again, I talked about the first phase is all about developing that positive core using a strengths-based mindset to truly understand a school's why. What's their motivation? Why are they there? What is their personal why? If you think of Simon Sinek, what is their personal why? What drives us with our work? Then you shift to phase 2, where you're developing that school performance profile. So now we're getting a more global understanding of what the current state is in terms of leadership support, school conditions, classroom practice, student achievement. So where are they at? What's our whole picture? And then once we have that clear picture, then we can say, okay, so our students are showing some strengths here and in showing some opportunities for growth here. What classroom practice will truly support that, right? So if the students are struggling with foundational reading skills, an effective practice may be small groups. So then we move to phase 3, and we start thinking about, okay, what will our gold standard behaviors look like? What does research say are the best practices for small groups to support specific student learning strengths and areas for growth or opportunities for growth? And then once that gets in place, once you have your plan in place, like these are the behaviors that we want to see, then we move to phase 4 where we're monitoring, and then phase 5 where again, where we're reflecting. This is just another way, another graphic that is very similar to the phase 1 that I showed you before. And so now we get to the school renewal rounds process, and what you will see is some significant alignment with the Hill model and the Hill phases. So you see on the left here, the initial data-driven inquiry process. So that's just, the development of, okay, what's our why, getting some data pieces together, starting to build that profile as we talked about earlier. And then you move over here to focusing rounds. And so these focusing rounds are when you're going in and looking at the big picture. You haven't developed what the Harvard model would call a problem of practice. So that focus is not developed yet. So, say as a school, maybe you're a new principal, or maybe you just want to start from ground zero. Maybe that's in your plans. And you're looking at focusing rounds. And you're saying, okay, where are we at? Let's look at everything. Let's have a team come in and look at everything. They might be all external, it might be all internal, it might be a mix. It depends on you and your context at your school. So in conjunction with that, you're doing a deep data dive. So we're going to go in, we're looking at the big picture, but now we're going to start to really look at the student data. You shift over here to the middle. Once you have an idea and say, hey, we're thinking, we have the data showing us that our students are showing gaps in reading, in foundational reading skills. What practices do we currently have in place that will support student achievement in those areas? Where do we need to refine that work? So then that next step will be targeted rounds. So now we have an idea and we really want to narrow down, okay, so what is our high leverage area of literacy instruction? Where do we want to focus our work and our efforts in developing our gold standard behaviors? And so this is where you're digging into the research. You might conduct multiple iterations of rounds until you determine what is that high leverage area. So for example, in one school we did rounds, we went in, first set of rounds, we looked at the gradual release. We found strengths in many areas, but we found some strengths in small groups where we're like, okay, we can really grow in this area. We have some things in place, but let's continue to grow and refine what we're looking at. So as part of that, we determined in that first set of rounds that routines and transitions were an opportunity for growth. So we discussed that with the school team, the teachers, and then provided some professional learning, and then provided some resources and supports, and then came back into classroom 2 months later and noticed that the routines and transitions were on point. They were effective. There was maximization of instructional learning time. But we're like, okay, so what we found in that one was that the students were really working closely with, or were really working well when they were in the small group with their teacher, but that there were opportunities for growth for the students away from the teacher so that they didn't interrupt the teacher, so that they were focusing on relevant tasks, that were using authentic text to support their own learning, right? So then at that point, we're like, okay, this is where our major leverage point is right here. And so we developed a gold standard guide based around the small group work away from the teacher. And what should those behaviors look like for teachers, for students, and for any leadership support? And so once we had that in place, action plan and goal set, and set goals. And now we had our gold standard guide in hand. And so the next step is to monitor. And so at that point, you do monitoring rounds. So rather than thinking of it as a checklist, you have gold standard behaviors that the team is going in and observing to determine, are these in place? And in a perfect world, the teachers are driving this process. So as you move from left to right, you may be able to start with teachers. You might have a culture that welcomes and supports that, but maybe you don't. Maybe you need to grow it from maybe your leadership team with support from external. And then as you shift to the right and teachers are owning the process, maybe it turns into all teachers are the rounds teams with the principal merely facilitating the conditions for that to happen. Maybe one of the teachers is facilitating the rounds process. So just thinking about as you're working through, you're kind of funneling into a more specific world to where you go from the big picture to, okay, this is where we're really going to focus our work. This is our instructional priority growth target and is aligned with student priority growth targets. Now we know where we need to go. And so as you continue to go, including teacher voices is a very powerful aspect of it. Because again, one of the major outcomes that we're looking for is that collective ownership and collective understanding of practice. And so here, I wanted to provide a slide that talked about when you use which type of rounds. So I'm not going to read all of this to you, but this is a resource for you to consider when you're thinking, okay, which kind of rounds? Should we look at the big picture, or are we more here in targeted rounds? You know, we have an idea like, hey, we think small groups is the way to go, but you want to get a clear, more data-driven understanding of where the school is collectively rather than teacher by teacher. You know, or maybe you already have that in place and you're ready for monitoring rounds. Maybe you're ready for that, but again, this slide is for your resources and for your reference so that you can consider and think about as a team, where should we start? And so in the beginning, I've already touched on this a little bit, but in the beginning, the principal and leadership team provide the rationale and purpose. You know, why are we using this process? Why aren't we just using teacher evaluation or walkthroughs, you know, like we've done in the past? Why shift to this? So that's the job of the principal leadership team, to provide that rationale and purpose, answer questions and address concerns, and organize the process through scheduling and acquiring substitutes. We all know that getting substitutes is a challenge at times for some schools, but we want to make sure that we have the opportunities to do so. So there is that, you know, that where you need to work on the machine of it, thinking about what will the schedule look like, what will the substitutes look like. But once that is in place, then the work can move forward. The teachers, we want them to engage in dialogue around questions and concerns, participate in the process when they can. And again, depending on your culture, maybe it's right away, maybe it's down the road a bit, and just open their doors to the volunteer teams in terms of, you know, say, hey, come and see what I do. Come and observe what we're doing in the classrooms, because I know as a teacher that I'm not being judged, that this isn't linked to my evaluation. As it evolves, you know, say you do one set of rounds and you're getting ready for another and then another, and you plan that out for the year. Embedded within that plan, as you can see, the principal and leadership team continue to organize, provide the needed time and resources, and then work to delegate increasing responsibility to teachers. So again, the goal is the principal, as you can see in this picture, will have a bigger role in the beginning. Teachers might not have as big of one, but as the process evolves, the teachers develop more of a role, and the principal's role diminishes in terms of just, you know, facilitating those conditions and supporting the teachers as they begin to collectively own practice and collectively own the next, you know, the next best steps for learning. And so the principal can support that with, you know, okay, here's our professional learning opportunities. Let's work as a team and determine what are our next best steps for professional learning. And so as you can see, assume more responsibility, develop that relational trust. We know, and research tells us that if there is relational trust embedded within the school, it supports the increases in collective ownership. And so when teachers trust each other and are open with each other, and there is just that feeling, you know, when you walk into a school and you can feel it, and divergent voices are welcomed and heard, teachers are not afraid to take risks, it becomes increasingly powerful. And that all starts with trust. And again, rounds also supports the increase in the breadth and depth of personal and collective networks. And so maybe as a first grade teacher, you don't have the opportunity to see a fourth grade teacher. But through rounds, you have that opportunity, and you go in and you see something that's just amazing and awesome in your eyes, but that you didn't even know they were doing. And so now you have that access to expertise, and you can say, hey, I know we haven't really talked much before, but that was awesome what I saw. How did you do that? Right? And so just really getting deeper into those relationships to where expertise is shared and spread across the network. So, you know, I've touched on this a little bit, but supporting phases 1 and 2 of school renewal rounds. So school renewal rounds supports the development of comprehensive school performance profile. It elucidates strengths, growth edges, and instructional, leadership supports, and school conditions. Combined with a deep dive in the data, deep dive into the data, schools are able to work towards aligning their instructional growth edges to their priority student growth. So again, getting a really clear and objective picture of what classroom instruction looks like. And again, you can see here, I just wanted to show in relation to the phases. And so just trying to think in your head, how does this align with how we work on school improvement? Supporting phase 3. So again, I touched on this just in terms of really developing that gold standard work. And what do we expect to see in every single classroom? What is our focus? We're not going to work on 10 different things. We're not going to work on read alouds. We're not going to work on small groups. What is our focus? Where is our first best, next best step, if that makes sense? And so using rounds at this point to develop what it looks like in the classroom and to adapt and create integrity adaptations, or, what are those, how can we make that happen within our classroom with a clear understanding of our personnel resources, time, all of those things that are unique to each school. And again, as you can see, just in relation, this is phase 3. So we've done all the legwork in terms of understanding the comprehensive picture, using a strengths-based approach. Now in phase 3, we're really getting down to the evidence-based practices that we want to see in every classroom. So I'm going to pause for a minute. I've talked a lot. I've shared a lot of information. Just take a couple of minutes and answer these 2 questions with each other, if you would. Welcome back. So now all the gold standard work has been done. All the teachers have collaborated on that. The principal has a clear understanding. And now we're at a point where we're monitoring for gold standard behaviors. Now we're at a point where rounds teams, hopefully all driven by teachers, and where teachers are the participants within the rounds process, where they are now going to monitor and say, hey, we agreed upon these gold standard behaviors with these integrity adaptations for possibly each grade level, or maybe grade level bands, maybe K1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Again, that's a school specific decision, but now we know what we're looking for. So let's go in and see if we see it in every classroom, right? And so at that point, we're thinking about, okay, we have our plan in place and we're monitoring what's happening. And through that monitoring, we might say, hey, we're really starting to see this take place, or hey, we need some professional learning in these specific areas to support our implementation. But again, it's all rooted in classroom practice. It's not rooted in assumptions. It's rooted in our agreed upon gold standard behaviors and how we're monitoring them. And so if all teachers have a voice in that and they own that, then that collective ownership will increase, and it just benefits the school as a whole, benefits teachers, and it benefits students. So again, you can see where is that at in the process. And so you'll see here in phase 4 is what I'm talking about. And so thinking about, as you move through school improvement, school renewal, whatever you may call it, it's all about refining, right? And it's all about monitoring, developing, refining, and monitoring what's in place. We don't want to establish things and then say, hey, we're going to monitor something different. So the whole purpose is getting collective ownership and alignment, right? And so questions that you may ask yourselves when you're making the decision to start a renewal cycle. So now you've gone through and you've monitored your implementation of, let's say, small groups. So the key questions you ask yourself before you move on to your next step is, are we consistently seeing our agreed upon vital behaviors in all classrooms? Are we seeing those gold standard behaviors embedded within every classroom on a consistent basis? Are we seeing improvements in student achievement? Or are we still seeing gaps in implementation and or achievement? So, if you look below, so if the answer to A or B is yes, the school team should collaboratively dig into the data and reflect on potential causes. So now you might think of like a root cause analysis, or you might consider, okay, so what possibly may be causing gaps in implementation or gaps in achievement? What are we seeing? Let's maybe go back and look at comprehensive views of the data and say, okay, this is what we're seeing. Maybe we need to do another rounds to see what does classroom practice look like, so that we can better understand maybe our next best steps. And again, you'll see the arrow. And again, I'm just trying to have you follow through the phases of the Hill Project school renewal process. But again, thinking in your mind, what does that look like for our own school improvement processes? And so again, I just wanted to return to this just to support thinking around what does this process look like in the whole, and then in pieces and back to the whole again. And so again, you can see this process from beginning to end. It's all about narrowing in, starting with the big picture, understanding and really digging into a high leverage practice that will support student priority growth targets, i.e. where are they showing strengths and where are they showing some possible gaps in performance, planning your action steps, which could include professional learning and what those evidence-based research or those evidence-based practices will look like in the classroom, developing that gold standard guide, and then using that gold standard guide to drive your monitoring. And so just to kind of sum things up, so there are some important outcomes of the school renewal rounds process that we have observed as we have implemented it within the HILL project. You get increasingly distributed teacher leadership, teachers owning learning, teachers facilitating learning, teachers supporting each other in their learning. You see collective teacher efficacy and individual teacher efficacy as well. So they believe in themselves as an individual and collectively. Shared vision and language around research-based practices. So if you think about it, you're doing your dissertation, you have your 30-second speech. Can everyone in that school speak upon where they are, their goals, their current state in that 30-second blurb? Or are they all saying different things? Because that will elucidate where maybe some gaps in learning might be and where some strengths are. But the goal is to really get that common language around interdependence. People know that they can trust each other, rely on each other, support each other if maybe they need something. There's that trust where people are afraid, or not afraid, but people are not afraid to take risks, where they're like, we're in a learning environment. I'm going to try this and see if it works. What do you guys think? Evidence of effective instructional practices in every classroom. Again, we don't want pockets of excellence. We want schools of excellence, right? Where every classroom is driven by evidence-based research practices. We have coherent learning environments where everything makes sense. Students are showing strengths in one area, might need some, have some growth opportunities in another. What are our teachers doing to support those strengths and those growth opportunities? And how is leadership supporting that? And how are we creating school conditions that support student learning? Shared understanding around teaching and learning. What are we seeing? What are our commonalities? Where might we have some divergences that we need to focus on? And there's just an established culture of reflective learning and practice that we are reflecting, hey, did that work? I'm not sure if that worked, but I'm going to think about that and just really reflect upon it like we do every single day. I remember when I was a teacher, if something didn't work, I went home and I'm like, why didn't that work? But just, developing that in a common sense so it's not a teacher feeling isolated and alone. And if you see this, there's increased collective ownership. We are a team. Nobody's left out. Everybody plays a part. And as you can see, as time goes on, the role of the teachers increases and the role of the principal decreases. That's not saying the principal's not doing anything or that the teachers are doing everything. It's that there's that flattening of the hierarchy to where everybody's a learner, where it's not just the teacher evaluation process that's connected to instruction. Now it's teachers collectively observing and collectively working out next steps. And so it's not just a one-way conversation, now it's a two-way conversation. And so again, I shared this in my other presentation, but if you think of this, appreciative inquiry opens opportunities. We focus on strengths, it opens the door to opportunities. Opportunities grow into new strengths. New strengths nurture motivation. Motivation feeds commitment. Commitment breeds collective ownership, and collective ownership gets it done. So main outcome of school renewal rounds is that the team is so driven by their work with each other that they feel this glue to each other that they want to grow collectively to benefit all students. And so again, thank you for your time. My name is Jeremy Andrick. I'm Program Manager on the HILL Project. I appreciate your time. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out.